Formula One has formally rejected Michael Andretti's bid to join the grid with General Motors and Cadillac. Now, Scott, this is probably the news we all expected. Certainly you did. But the statement has been a bit more emphatic than maybe any of us anticipated, right?
Yeah, I think so. We've kind of been expecting this for a little while. We know that they've had FIA approval, I think, since October last year, towards the end of 2023. But there was always a bit of a hurdle to overcome with getting F1 on side. We've known for a long time that the commercial rights holder and the existing teams weren't that keen on an 11th team joining the grid. And that was something that Andretti was going to have to do a really, really big job, basically, to overcome. Didn't ever really feel like they were going to. I don't want to say that the mind was made up and there was nothing they could have done to change F1's mind. They would have just had to do an awful lot. That said, the way that F1 has responded to this with an absolutely emphatic statement, tearing apart basically the Andretti bid from everything from the would-be competitiveness to the details of the entry to the lack of commercial value and irrelevance of the name, effectively. It was a pretty cutting breakdown of the application and not necessarily completely accurate.
Now, that emphatic statement hasn't exactly gone down super well. Scott, I know you've been in touch with a lot of F1 figures and, a lot of people in and around the paddock over the process of this F1 bid. And I know you know the logic and you're not unsympathetic to much of the logic. But, I mean, it's clear fans are going to be really, really angry at this. And, just while F1 is denying an iconic name and entry, we have Haas with all of its uncertainties that we've discussed so much. And we have a team on the grid that's now called Visa Cash App RB. So are you a bit sympathetic with what's going to be a backlash here to this Andretti decision?
Oh, I absolutely am. I always understood that there was a desire to protect the existing teams that had gone through an awful lot over the last 10 years or so, especially in COVID, when at the start of the pandemic there were several teams, not just one, that looked like they could have been on the financial brink and going into oblivion. So I always understood that, and I was willing to give the franchise model time, but I am completely sympathetic to the argument from fans, and I'm not going to say I regret asking people for their opinion, but I was trying to catch up on people's thoughts after I asked for what people made of the F1 rationale, and I haven't been able to been able to break the back of what people have been saying to it. So I understand that it's really upset a lot of people. There are some people who do seem to kind of be on F1's side with this, but if you're looking at it objectively from do fans want more teams on the grid, I think it's broadly a pretty emphatic yes. And do people understand why you say no to an Andretti backed by General Motors when ridiculous corporate sponsor-led names are becoming ever more present in Formula One and dominating the back end of the grid? I understand why people have a big problem against that as well.
Look at Mr. Popular over there. But yeah, going into that specific reasoning, because as you say, it's an emphatic and a detailed statement. First one that caught our eye is the assertion that the Andretti team would not be competitive, basically. Now, what do you make of that?
Yeah, that's a very big claim, considering the ability basically to put together a competent or competitive team is part of the FIA's prerequisite as well. And the FIA had no problem with that, otherwise it wouldn't have approved the entry in the first place. So not entirely sure what F1 is basing that on, beyond a claim that they, in the document that they put out, which is quite detailed, that one of the claims is that Andretti would be aiming to enter F1 in 2025, so they'd be building as a novice constructor a car for the 2025 regulations, which then in their first season of competition, they would then be building, and in advance of that, because you can't just do this in 1 year, they'd also be building a brand new car to completely different regulations in 2026. So the argument is that's a huge undertaking and it would impact their competitiveness. But that's exactly what Haas faced when it was allowed to join the grid in 2016 ahead of the 2017 regulation change. And that was a massive rule change for F1. So I don't know how you feel about that, Val, but for me that seems at least in terms of optics, hypocritical, and it seems to undercut the core of the argument.
I mean, I don't love the argument necessarily. I mean, that feels like something that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It's a hunch. Won't be competitive. And aren't there rules in place already in terms of how early you can start 2026 development?
Yes, exactly. So there's a limit in terms of the aerodynamic work that you can do. So you can't. The other teams aren't starting that now. They've not got this massive advantage. Admittedly, you could look at it the other way and say, well, that means that Andretti doesn't have a massive advantage and can't use the fact that they're not competing in F1 in 2024. But it's this system exists to try and give people kind of equal status when it comes to developing their cars, and it's part of the competition. And ultimately, I don't really think it's F1's place as the commercial rights holder to say whether or not Andretti could or would be capable technically of doing that in 25 and 26, when Haas showed, albeit with a very different model, that it could be done back in 2016.
And I think there's a difference between competitive and respectable. And I think you could argue respectable if respectable was a question, but competitive is such a nebulous term. There's another quite strange thing there in the reasoning, and it's the customer engine point. Now, we'll get to that in a bit more detail. I do wonder, and I wanted to ask you about this, do you think that's a reference to the fact that GM isn't building its own engines to begin with, and it's sort of a way to indirectly address that? Because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Customer engines are
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I think it's got to be a reference to that, because more than once in F1's rationale here, they bring up the fact that if this was a General Motors engine from the start, that they would look on it differently. But they seem to be arguing that by forcing an existing manufacturer into what would be known to be a short-term partnership, because they've got this General Motors engine theoretically being built for 2028, so it would be a 25, 26, 27 deal. You're backing an existing manufacturer into a corner. They've got to share some know-how and technology and the way their engines work and all of this that you'll learn as a customer for an organisation that is about to build its own works engine anyway. I again feel like that's quite a stretch to be using that as an argument. I've got the exact wording of it here, where they said that they've dismissed it basically, the customer engine deal, was something that would be damaging to the prestige and standing of the championship, which I think that's an enormous claim, considering F1's lifeblood are its customer teams, and McLaren, and this is a different situation because McLaren is doing it in the long term with Mercedes, but McLaren is plotting a course that it believes will take it to fighting for world championships again as a customer. That is underpinning the entire McLaren plan in the medium to long term. So to say that a short-term customer engine deal before becoming a works team would be damaging to F1 standing, I don't see that is a valid claim to make.
It's a real eyebrow raiser. And I think here's another point that feels custom made to make for arguments online, is the claim that there is, what did they call it? They said some familiarity for the Andretti name, but that ultimately F1 would bring more to the Andretti name than the Andretti name would bring to F1.
That's been interpreted very negatively by obviously Andretti supporters in the US, and people who obviously appreciate the history of motorsport in general, not just F1, but also specifically F1, because I think a certain Mario Andretti would be recognisable in historical terms, but also to a contemporary audience as well, a modern audience as well, because it's not like Mario's like hidden away somewhere and irrelevant. I do think people know him. I accept that the Andretti name maybe doesn't carry the weight of a Ferrari, but what name does? And again, I use the comparison, but if you're comparing it to what's on the grid at the moment, Andretti is definitely a more recognisable and a bigger and more relevant name than Haas. No one knows what to call Visa, Cash App, Racing Bulls, RB, F1 team. Stake is nothing. It's a middling identity that basically exists to bridge the gap between now and the Audi era, and that's at least going to be the start of a proper works team in Formula One. So I give Stake the benefit of the doubt there, but I think it's ludicrous. The exact wording that you were looking for was carry some recognition for F1 fans, which I think that does sell the Andretti name a little bit short. I didn't ever think that the Andretti name was a particularly strong foundation for this bid, just because the name was relevant several decades ago in an F1 context anyway. That wasn't particularly strong, but this does feel a little bit dismissive and perhaps a little bit disingenuous in the context of what we have on the grid elsewhere.
Yeah, I see where they're coming from, but it does feel like a phrase designed to annoy people. But now we get to what I feel is the important part, is the main part, which is that F1 feels the Andretti entry will not bring a clear-cut commercial benefit.
Yeah, well, we always thought that this would come down to money, and there are different elements that feed into this financially. I'll get onto it a little bit more in a moment, but there's the whole anti-dilution fund and what fee Andretti would have to pay the existing teams to get on the grid. But this effectively boils down to F1 seeing no commercial gain to having Andretti on the grid. Having an 11th team on the grid on its own isn't enough to make F1 go, oh, commercially, that's a great idea, so we're definitely in. And as the commercial rights holder, that's effectively all they're interested in. I think it does tie into the previous point about Andretti getting more out of coming into F1 than F1 gets from Andretti coming in. And one of the things that was said in the statement was they said that they were not able to identify any material expected positive effect for the commercial rights holders' financial results, which it views as a key indicator of the pure commercial value of the championship. I don't know what research specifically they've done to determine that, but that feels a bit dismissive, because I know it's different when you're trying to judge the merits of the existing teams versus a new team, because the existing teams are already here, right? You don't have to tear up the framework or the structure to fit them in, because they already exist. But again, I think that could apply to almost half the teams on the current grid. So it just feels a little bit limp. If you throw it in with all the other reasons, maybe it has a bit more relevance, but it does feel a little bit limp. We've glossed over one really important bit, and that's my fault because I didn't flag it up to you in my notes before this, Val. But obviously, we haven't addressed the fact that there is no room for an 11th team, which kind of reared its head a little bit, because they basically said, I'll just double check here so I don't get this wrong. It would place an operational burden on race promoters and basically make life a little bit more difficult for existing competitors by taking up more space. Do you have any sympathy for that argument, given that this is a paddock that has a garage given to F1 for hospitality purposes now, and occasionally houses an 11th team for the Brad Pitt Apple F1 movie?
I don't want to say I don't have any sympathy, because I'm not a specialist when it comes to logistics. I want to say that it feels absolutely ridiculous that we've, at this point in this process, after this whole situation has been kicked off by the governing body of the sport, and we've had all these applications, suddenly, oh, no room. Like, that feels like something that should have been agreed or disagreed or completely hashed out.
How was nobody
months
totting
ago.
up the garages to begin with? Going 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh no, we don't have enough.
If there is a reason for Andretti supporters to feel good at least about some part of the statement, and I mean feel good, relatively speaking, given how stern and harsh the rest of it is, it's that if one said, and I might not be getting the wording right here, it may take a different view of an Andretti entry for 2028 when Cadillac GM has pledged to build its own engine.
Yeah, so it's basically that they would have to view it differently. They would look upon the circumstances, what it brings to F1, and therefore the whole application in a different light if it was coming in from the start as a works team. We sort of hinted at that earlier with the reference to being a customer in the short term. And there's a clear emphasis here that if Andretti tries this again for 2028, then maybe they would actually be successful, because then it's just coming in as an out-and-out works team. The customer engine thing doesn't apply. The value it brings to the championship is different because it is a fully fledged manufacturer team, and General Motors would presumably be giving it even more support, given that it would be the works team. But cynically, there are two things here that I'm a little bit sceptical about. One is, I said about the anti-dilution fund earlier. That fee is $200 million at the moment, but basically the existing teams want to pretty much triple it because they don't feel that it actually matches the cost of what they would lose for an 11th team coming in, and the value of an entry has gone up. So they want to massively increase that. Andretti would have to pay that massively inflated fee if they joined in 2028 instead of 2025. So it would be an enormous extra cost to Andretti. That's partly why I feel like some people want to defer it, kick it down the road. The second reason is if you tell Andretti, no, all hope's not lost, try again for 2028, then maybe that puts them off taking action against the decision now, because otherwise I fear that this will descend into a really long, unpleasant legal mess as Andretti tries to challenge this F1 decision. And I feel like this might be F1 saying, if you don't do that and play ball, there's a seat at the table for you in the longer term.